Hey DDI, I'm Sean Kennedy, and this is part two of From Slavery to Mass Incarceration. Um, when we started, or when we left off, I'm sorry, part one, it was roughly 1915, 1916, and Jim Crow had emerged in southern states. But the part of the story that we've spent significantly less time discussing to this point is the relationship between the racial caste system and northern states. And in part, that's because prior to 1915 and the Great Migration, while there certainly were African Americans living in northern states, there were relatively fewer living in northern states than in southern states, in part because it was chattel slavery and the agrarian economy of the South that brought Black folks to the Americas in the first place. So as a result, prior to 1915, there was a much larger population of African American folks living in the South than in the North. But with the advent of Jim Crow, the Great Migration began, and it saw roughly 6 million Black folks move north from the South as laws enforcing segregation took hold. Now, while the Jim Crow laws did not formally exist in northern states for Black folks are still hardly a utopian or free place. So there are some things that are fundamentally different between northern and southern states. For one, most importantly, there are jobs, albeit often not high-paying jobs, but there are plenty of jobs for Black folks in the North, working in various kinds of manufacturing, working as secretaries, janitors, working as teachers in some cases, working as porters in train cars. So there are any number of jobs in a variety of different industries, some manufacturing economy, some service sector economy. It's still the case that there, in the northern states, there was significant and virulent employment discrimination against Black folks that permitted them from advancing in fields in which they excelled. And it's still the case that there were many areas of employment that were entirely segregated and where it was difficult or impossible for Black folks to break in. For example, the construction industry and its particular labor organizations were notably anti-Black and tended towards racial discrimination, not in every case, but in many cities and in many of the labor movements that were involved with the construction industry. So in northern states, it's certainly possible for Black folks to find work and to find jobs, but it's important to note that there is employment discrimination. That said, by contrast to the really vicious regimes of racial terrorism and lynching in the South and really, really, really limited career prospects for Black folks in the South, northern states are relatively better places to find work, and the jobs there are relatively higher paying. And in part, that's because the political economy of the United States from the 1840s and 50s through to 1915 has really fundamentally changed, and that's true for the global economy as well. In the early 1800s and in the early years of the United States of America, economies globally were largely agrarian economies. Political economic theory in France, for example, the physiocrats were some of the really influential political economic theorists, focused on agriculture in the late 1700s and early 1800s as the source of the production of economic value. As society and the global economy shifts into the early 1900s, manufacturing and industrialization have really taken hold, and production processes have become more standardized. 1915 is the very beginning of the automobile industry in the United States. Assembly lines are just starting to be built. There are increasingly sophisticated technological systems for the mass production of goods and commodities. And those include Taylorism, which we'll talk about a little bit when we talk about political economy in the next lecture series. But Taylorism was developed, which attempted to sort of in a scientific way, in the sense of labor organization, get down to the minute roughly how much time it should take a worker to produce a given unit on an assembly line. So they're getting increasingly standardized and technologically sophisticated manufacturing systems. So as a result, a lot of the real value to be extracted from the economy lies in using these new sciences of industrial design and labor organization and the new science of manufacturing technology to build increasingly standardized and efficient production processes. So the value to be found is in making your system more efficient and more productive than other systems. And in the process, part of that value is extracted by paying workers less. And that means that in the northern states, because the goal is to reduce the cost per unit of production by, for example, using technology to replace labor or to make labor more efficient, including Black folks in the manufacturing economy just makes sense because it's a way of driving down wages. The same is true with immigration. There's just a boom in immigration during the same time period from Europe to the United States, from places like Italy and Ireland and Poland and Germany to the United States at roughly the same time as the Great Migration is occurring. And part of the rationale there is the same, that there's these large manufacturing economies in major northern cities in which the employers want to bring in as many workers as they possibly can. So there's a real disincentive at the very lowest entry-level positions to discriminate too much on the basis of race or ethnicity, because if you do that, it means you can't drive down wages. So there are some economically self-interested reasons why northern manufacturing economies have somewhat less employment discrimination at the lowest levels of organizations. So it's, going into northern states, there are real motivations for Black folks to go to major northern cities like Chicago, St. Louis, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., even Baltimore, Detroit, Kansas City, Milwaukee. A lot of these cities, Gary, Indiana, and Indianapolis, a lot of these cities have various different manufacturing economies associated with them. And those change over time from what we would now call like textile manufacturing, making clothing, making t-shirts, making just sort of everyday household goods, things like paper or other types of just basic consumer goods, to what we would now call advanced manufacturing, things like cars, refrigerators, toasters, microwaves, etc. Much more high dollar, sophisticated products that bring in lots of money. So those things change over time, and we'll talk about those changes a bit in a second. But in essence, that manufacturing economy and the changing conditions of U.S. political economy mean that it makes a lot of sense for Black folks to move to the North, because there's more jobs, there's relatively more opportunity. While there are still plenty of instances of racial terror and racial intimidation, those instances are somewhat more regulated and controlled, and the outright program of lynching and racial terrorism that's occurring in the South in the early 1900s is somewhat less, relatively speaking, absent in the North than in the South. Those things do happen, but they're less frequent occurrences than they are in the South during that same time period. So there are a lot of protections, there are a lot more protections for Black people in the North. It's possible for them to go into some kinds of bars. There are some integrated bars, especially in neighborhoods with what at the time would have been considered ethnic white folks, like Irish and Italian folks and Black folks. There are some integrated music clubs. It's possible for them to get jobs. Some, although not all Black folks have the ability to vote. They have some forms of legal protection. But at the same time, it's important to note that just as there is still incredible employment discrimination, there's also incredible discrimination in in housing. There are housing covenants in a lot of suburban and exurban neighborhoods that are more expensive and richer, that prevent Black folks from moving there. There's redlining that prevents Black people from living in certain buildings and that restricts them to certain neighborhoods within the city. There are social, religious, and sexual norms that prevent commingling with Black folks, that discourage socializing with Black folks or intermarrying with Black folks between Black and white folks. So there's still a lot of social control and white over Black racism occurring in the North. But relatively speaking, it is the case that there is significantly more opportunity for Black folks. And that becomes, well, that's less the case in 1916, as we'll talk about. Over time, that opportunity gap between the North and the South begins to grow, in part due to the changing nature of the manufacturing economy in the US and the changing conditions of the labor movement in the United States. So one of the things that happens as a result of redlining and social norms, if not legal norms, mandating segregation between Black and white folks in these northern cities, is that there is a strong ghettoization of Black folks in the North. And Louis Quant talks about ghettos as vehicles for extracting Black labor to serve northern manufacturing interests while still maintaining a racial caste system. So the North does want Black folks there so that their labor can be fed into the machine of the manufacturing economy. But at the same time, it wants Black folks to be largely invisible, especially to the respectable white society. So there's some intermingling between poor, ethnic, quote unquote, white folks and Black folks in the working class neighborhoods. There's some intermingling there, but there's very little intermingling between the middle and upper class white folks and Black folks in those areas. They want them to work in their factories, but those white folks do not want to have social intermingling with Black folks. What Quant provides what I think is a really useful definition of ghettoization in the ghetto. He argues that the term has been under-theorized in discussions both of political economy and American racism. And he defines it as a quote, socio-political device that enables a dominant status group in an urban setting simultaneously to ostracize and exploit a subordinate group endowed with negative symbolical capital, unquote. He argues that ghettos during this time period especially, but into the future as well, function as a, quote, ethno-racial prison marked by stigma, constraint, territorial confinement, and organizational parallelism and insulation. So in this sense, while Black institutions, styles of living, and social codes arise in urban areas like Detroit, New York, Chicago, etc., while there are enormously influential artistic and cultural movements like the Harlem Renaissance occurring, like the development of jazz music and a real huge flourishing of African-American poetry and literary thinking. While those things are occurring, at the same time, those Black neighborhoods and Black communities are locked in structural relationships of dependency and subordination with respect to the white capital owners in those northern industrial areas, the white folks that live in places like Manhattan and Westchester County, or in the Lake Shore in Chicago or in Oak Park. So there's still, on the one hand, in the North, there's a little bit more opportunity for Black folks to develop their own internal sense of political and social culture, using the opportunities afforded by the manufacturing economy to really springboard a flourishing of Black artistic and literary movements, and music as well. But at the same time, while those things are occurring and while those things are meaningful and incredibly influential into today and into the way that American culture looks now, at the same time, it's important to realize that those neighborhoods and communities are still locked in an exploitative relationship with the wider urban environment in which they're located. And that's marked by redlining, housing discrimination, and social and cultural codes of segregation. So during this time period of the Great Migration, as I talked about earlier, there's this emerging manufacturing economy. And arguably the most important part of that manufacturing economy is the gradual emergence of the automobile. Um, this is a time between 1916 and the end of World War II when there is a tremendous amount of violence involved in the labor movement in the United States. So there's a major push in a variety of areas: coal mining, auto work, the production of iron and other industrial goods, rubber and tires, all sort of different industrially produced goods, textile work as well. There's a real labor movement pushing to organize workers who are being treated, especially in the early 1900s, with just incredible disregard by these manufacturing titans. And this is a time really off the back of the Gilded Age, in which there are very few labor protections for workers, and in which a very large number of really, really wealthy industrialists, often called the robber barons, have exploited a significant amount of US capital, have extracted many of the gains of industrialization from railroads, from the development of steam power and coal, from iron and the standardization of iron production processes, from textile manufacturing. So there are just a number of different robber barons who've extracted huge sums of wealth with very little protection for workers, who are largely treated as disposable. So at this time, labor unions are really starting to develop. And this is really also the heyday of socialism in the United States and the development of a socialist workers' movement. Those movements are in many ways met with extreme violence on the part of industrialists and the leaders of the extractive economy, of fossil fuel extracting barons in oil and coal. As those workers attempt to strike and to organize themselves, the industrialists hire Pinkertons, who are essentially private sector, they're called detectives, but they're essentially private sector thugs sent to beat and in many cases murder the leadership of labor unions. And labor unions themselves at this time take on more of a paramilitary quality, where many of them are armed and participate in strikes that often descend into fights and violence. So at this time, there's a tremendous amount of unrest in northern cities and in some of the parts of the Appalachian United States as well, where these labor movements are clashing with industrialists. There's a tremendous amount of economic inequality, and workers are largely treated as being disposable. Now, in the early years of these labor movements, there's relatively little interracial solidarity. But as the Great Migration grows in size and political significance, there's kind of an increasing amount of organizational solidarity between Black and white workers across a number of areas. That's compounded by the Great Depression, as well as the experience of serving alongside one another in World War II, and in some cases in World War I as well. So after the late 1930s, both the AFL and the CIO, two of the largest labor organizations in the United States, started actively enrolling Black workers. And that's especially, that interracial labor solidarity is especially pronounced in the auto industry, which was arguably the most important industry in the emerging American industrial economy. So increasingly in the late 1930s, a lot of white and Black workers are joining together in labor unions and are enrolled together. Now, again, I don't want to paint an overly romantic picture of what's going on in these labor unions. In many cases, there's still significant anti-Black prejudice and racism in labor unions, but union leaders begin to see, in part because of Philip Randolph, a really important Black union organizer, the wisdom in banding together with Black workers. And that's in part, as I mentioned before, because in the northern industrial manufacturing economy, workers are being treated as interchangeable. So there's a recognition that even if white workers don't like Black workers, and frankly, if Black workers don't like white workers either because they're treated very badly by them, then there's still some mutual self-interest involved in banding together. And at the same time, there is, I don't want to paint the picture too much the opposite way either. There is some real interracial labor solidarity that begins to develop, and some sociality between Black and white communities in these major northern industrial cities starts to develop on the basis of labor relationships where they fight side by side against what are at times some incredibly vicious northern industrialists and some very, very poor working conditions. So they are able to make common cause in a number of different places. So as this industrial economy starts to develop, there's increasing sort of solidarity between the poorest white and black folks working together in labor unions. That's especially true, like I said, after the late 1930s. World War II, it plays a really, and the Great Depression, both play really important roles in the changing nature of the racial caste system in the US and in the story of Jim Crow's eventual downfall. During the Great Depression, in order to win support for New Deal programs, Roosevelt often had to cut deals with Southern Democrats, many of whom were significantly more conservative on race-related policy than Roosevelt himself, who was very interested in extending many of his biggest policies to African Americans and in ensuring that the civil service was desegregated so that black folks could participate in all sorts of different political institutions, post office, they could hold office in the Foreign Service Corps, all sorts of different institutions, the State Department, et cetera. So in theory, in ideal terms, Roosevelt is in favor of integration and extending these New Deal programs to black folks as well. But in practice, Southern Democrats often ensure that, especially in the South, but often in the North as well, that black folks aren't able to get access to some of the biggest benefits of the New Deal. So the New Deal does help black folks a lot, and does create a situation in which black folks are able to build some capital and expand their sense of opportunity. But at the same time, it's not nearly the boon that the New Deal programs are for white workers. That's especially true in the South, but it's true in the North as well, in part due to the influence of Southern Democrats on the formation of New Deal legislation. And one of the unrealized dreams of the Roosevelt administration that for years becomes sort of a rallying cry, both for Martin Luther King Jr. and the Association of Black Political Economists, is the idea of a second economic Bill of Rights, which would in part ensure the enfranchisement of black folks in economic spheres as well, and ensure the protection of labor unions and the sort of mitigation of economic inequality in the US. But that second economic Bill of Rights never comes to pass during the Roosevelt administration, and it's always sort of an increasingly distant dream into the future, even as the civil rights movement gains steam and really builds power. So the New Deal programs do help black folks, but there's many important ways in which they're cut out of those programs. There's a whole history by the professor Ira Katznelson that talks about the myriad ways in which those New Deal programs did still engage in some pretty vicious racial discrimination against black folks. So the New Deal helps black folks, but it doesn't ensure the same sort of gains that happen for white workers during the period. World War II is a really important turning point for a couple of reasons. First, the US produces an enormous amount of propaganda decrying the racism of Nazi Germany. But it faces a really unpleasant contradiction, which is especially in the South, but also in many, like I said before, in more de facto ways in the North, there is pretty significant violence, segregation, and dehumanization of black folks. So the claim that the United States makes that it's a land of freedom, opportunity, individual liberty is belied by the treatment of black folks in the United States. And that's a wedge that the Nazis used to produce their own set of propaganda, decrying the racism of the United States as hypocritical and presenting the US as a country that is really backwards in many ways. And that Nazi propaganda is obviously opportunistic. The Nazis were vicious anti-black racists themselves, but they wanted to sow the seeds of discord among the American military and the American population during World War II. There's also, and somewhat in a somewhat more complex way during the same time period, there's also a significant amount, and this is connected to World War II and also the labor mobilizations we previously discussed, of communist propaganda in the United States decrying anti-Black racism and calling for Black folks to join with and support Soviet communism. And the history of these propaganda pieces is complex. There were many Black labor union organized and many Black intellectuals during the time period who became communists. Many of them later were sort of disgusted by both the failures of socialism in the United States to grapple with the reality of anti-Black racism and with the realities of Soviet socialism abroad and some of the really horrifying forms of violence that would later come to light. So there's a complex relationship between radical Black movements and communist politics in the 1930s and 1940s. But suffice to say, communist propaganda is somewhat less disingenuous than Nazi propaganda. It's not saying a whole lot. In arguing that communism is a philosophy that embraces racial equality and that embraces the position of all workers as being equally the same and equally important as the driving force of communist politics. During that time period, the 1930s and 1940s, during World War II, the U.S. is engaged in a propaganda war against both the Soviet Union, which, while an ally of the United States, is somewhat already of a tenuous ally, and with a propaganda war, more specifically with Germany. And so during that time period, there's a significant amount of U.S. propaganda that's attempting to build the idea of the U.S. as a land of freedom. In addition, during World War II, African-American soldiers play a really important role throughout the war in helping the effort, both in the Atlantic and the Pacific theaters. And the experience of fighting side by side during World War II created a feeling of solidarity for some white folks between them and Black folks. And that is only magnified later during the Korean War, again, when many white and Black folks served side by side during the war. So there's a real sense among at least some white folks, especially in large northern cities, that while if Black folks have given their lives and died to fight the country's wars, why is it that they can't vote in elections? Or why does the U.S. tolerate the sort of racist rhetoric of southern states, who in many ways are indistinguishable from the white supremacist rhetoric of the Nazi regime they just died or watched their friends die fighting in Europe? So there's a real sense of World War II really brings those contradictions between the sort of explicit official texts of American ideology and the realities of day-to-day lived experience for Black folks, really brings those contradictions to the forefront and makes them more obvious and more glaring. So during this time period in the North, on the one hand, there's still significant economic inequality between Black and white folks. A New Deal is passed that helps Black workers, but is much more advantageous for white workers. And there's still really quite vicious social, religious, and political segregation between Black and white folks. At the same time, there's a growing labor movement. There's a growing kind of set of texts and discourses coming out of World War II of solidarity between Black and white folks, and of the US as a country that doesn't want to be racist, doesn't want to be like the Nazis. And as a result, and there's also growing economic opportunity and economic power for Black folks in the North. It's building slowly, but it is starting to happen, in part due to labor victories and in part just simply due to the increasingly sophisticated, especially during the post-World War II period, industrial manufacturing landscape of the United States. So in the area after World War II, there's sort of an increasing sense that the conditions that have been allowed to persist in the South are simply not acceptable, partly because of labor unions, partly because of Black folks speaking out and speaking loudly about the way that they're treated, calling out the contradictions between Nazi propaganda and their actual treatment, or sorry, between US propaganda about the Nazis and their actual treatment in the United States. And partly due to the experience of World War II, producing a significant amount of solidarity between Americans who united fighting an external enemy. So during that time period, there's increasing cracks starting to form in Jim Crow in the South, in part due to the changing conditions of the US political economy in the North. So Jim Crow really starts to crack around 1945 during the post World War II era. Whites in the North begin to withdraw their support, in part because of the factors I've previously described. And the contradiction in rhetoric between the Nazis and the US becomes especially glaring. And even more of an issue, as I mentioned before, is the sense, and this becomes a real theme in the FBI's rhetoric about Black people in the 1950s and 1960s, there's a real sense that if the United States does not make concessions to Black political leaders and to Black political movements and give Blacks voting rights and recognition of personhood in the South, that many Black folks will be turned to the communist cause, which Americans increasingly see as a threat, as enmity between the US and the Soviet Union starts to grow. And as that Soviet propaganda starts to seem more and more appealing, it starts to directly insert itself into labor unions. Now, some of this history is, of course, red baiting and nonsense conjured by J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, and police institutions. They use the threat that Black folks are getting involved with communism to crack down on labor unions and to viciously repress Black political movements. They say, for example, that various civil rights leaders and various student leaders and student protest movements are affiliated with the Soviet government and have communist leanings, when in many cases there's no evidence of that. At the same time, I don't want to downplay the extent to which some of that socialist message is appealing to some groups of Black protesters and labor union mobilizations, because in part, in the history, the way the history has been told more recently, the role that socialism played as a mobilizing force in the civil rights movement and some of the thinking of people like Martin Luther King Jr. has really been erased. And instead those figures have been recast as colorblind liberals seeking to establish a free market democracy, when in fact that's just really not the case. That the idea of workers' mobilization played an incredibly important role in many of these movements for racial equality and to tear down the caste system of Jim Crow. So again, I want to reiterate that the Soviet Union and the threat of the Soviet Union created an environment in which there's a very complex dynamic going on. On the one hand, there is actual and real sentiment for socialism in some corners. On the other hand, there's red baiting, and the threat of the Soviet Union is often used to repress those movements, and sometimes without any justification at all and without any evidence. And that's not to say that there's ever a justification for repressing socialist movements per se. It's simply to say that in some cases there really were socialist movements that saw socialism as a necessary step to racial equality and recognition of Black personhood. And in other cases, it was simply fabricated as a convenient political excuse for policing violence. Okay, so around 1945, as I said before, Jim Crow begins to crack. The NAACP begins to mount successful challenges to segregation in federal courts in a number of different areas. A really important watershed moment in 1944 is the release of Gunnar Myrdal and Ralph Bunche's An American Dilemma. And it's a report funded by the Carnegie Foundation. It's 1,500 pages long. And it is essentially a review on the condition of Black folks in the United States. And it looks at American racism. Gunnar Myrdal was an enormously influential Swedish social democrat who the Carnegie Foundation hired to produce the report, in part because they thought a non-American would be more objective. And in his later years, Gunnar Myrdal was really a towering figure in the democratic socialist movement in Sweden and the labor mobilizations in that country, and played a really important role in the massive expansion of the Swedish welfare state. Ralph Bunche, who was Myrdal's chief researcher and writer on the report, was a PhD, a political science PhD, and the first African-American man to win the Nobel Prize for a mediation he undertook in Israel in the 1940s. So really this report was published by two people who had a lot of credibility. It's a 1,500-page long report, like I said, and it describes the problem of anti-Black racism in America as being based on what Myrdal and Bunche call the principle of culmination. And what that principle is that white people oppress Black people and then point to the poor performance of Black folks as evidence to justify oppression. And in part, this is happening, especially in the Jim Crow South, but as I said before, in the North, and some more de facto ways as well. In part, this is just a callback to the conservative philosophy of race relations we discussed in part 1, in which Southerners are constantly saying that, are pointing to a variety of different metrics to say that Black folks are not ready to have their personhood recognized and to be fully enfranchised in the Southern political economy. So they're pointing to things like levels of educational attainment, the amount of money that Black folks make, the fact that there are not more Black titans of industry and Black leaders in the South. And Myrdal and Bunche's report is so powerful in part because what they're really saying here is that this is a fundamentally dishonest argument that, really what's happening is that oppression is the problem. And essentially, almost a direct quote from the report is that the problem Black folks face in the United States, the problem of Black folks being at the bottom of the social hierarchy, Myrdal and Bunche say, is a white man's problem. It is a problem caused by white people in the United States, not caused by Black pathology or any inherent feature of Black folks that makes them inferior to white folks. So this is a really powerful report produced by two very credible people and funded by a major important philanthropic organization in the United States. And the report suggests as solutions, essentially one of two or both of two things. A, white folks need to be cured of their prejudice in order to allow for the advancement of Black people, or B, the situation of Black folks needs to be improved through governmental intervention to allow them to have the opportunity to demonstrate their already existing competency, talents, abilities, etc. To give them a stage on which to perform their abilities, because currently that stage does not exist. And the lack of performance is being shown in a very dishonest way as evidence that in some way Black people are inferior. And one of the things I want people to take away from this lecture is that, and the reason I'm spending so much time talking about this report is that in shocking ways, An American Dilemma predicts the Moynihan report, which we'll talk about later, released in the 1960s, which charged that the poor Black folks and poverty in the Black community was a byproduct of some inherent cultural pathology on the part of Black people. This report predicts the Moynihan report and argues that such a report is in fact a complete misunderstanding of what's happened to Black folks in America, that all of this evidence can be generated simply because Black people are oppressed. And in some ways, in really important ways, it predicts a lot of the arguments that are still prevalent today. So this An American Dilemma and the principle of culmination really have like incredible ongoing relevance to the status quo. You'll even see people in 2020 today saying that the reason that there are higher levels of COVID-19 deaths among Black folks is because of, that Black folks have bad eating habits, that they don't take personal responsibility for themselves, that they don't see doctors, they don't trust medicine, blah, 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 blah. They blame all of these things. They blame Black folks for poor health-related outcomes, when in fact, all of the scientific evidence indicates that those inequalities in healthcare outcomes are the byproduct of what are called social determinants of health. That are the byproduct of air pollution, deprivation of access to medical care and medical resources, food deserts, discrimination in employment, everyday racism, which produces what various health experts call weathering effects on people's quality of life. So there's a whole bunch of different social determinants of health that produce those bad health outcomes. And yet that principle of culmination, the oppression of Black people by white people, and then pointing to the bad outcomes as evidence that there's some pathology inherent in Black people, that is still an ongoing principle playing itself out on the stage of the American political economy. So I'm spending so much time on this report because it really does have profound insights into the way that American race relations continue to play out into 2020. So that report's released, and it just really does, I mean, this is before the civil rights movement has really taken off. It does really have a profound impact on intellectual circles among many folks in the North, because it's released by this major philanthropic organization by two people with really sterling academic credentials. And the civil rights movement kicks off in part because of a couple of different things happening. So as I mentioned before, the NAACP is really effectively mobilizing a series of legal challenges. At the same time, there are various labor mobilizations going on during this time period, looking to enroll Black folks in labor unions and looking to really build the power of those labor unions. And those people are aggressively negotiating for better rights for both Black and white workers in important industries like the auto industry. Against that background, An American Dilemma is released in 1944, and that report provides some real intellectual heft to the idea of Black political enfranchisement and recognition of Black personhood. And it really offers a profoundly detailed rebuttal to the idea that there is something to pseudoscientific theories of Black intellectual inferiority and social inferiority. So this background's all happening, and then Brown v. Board occurs in 1954. It's a significant decision because it ended 50 plus years of judicial deference on the part of the Supreme Court to the South, and enacted a sweeping shift in constitutional understanding at the federal level. As I mentioned before, the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment, which was instituted during the Radical Reconstruction, plays a foundational role in the legal reasoning behind the decision. The Browns are represented by NAACP lawyer Thurgood Marshall, who becomes a Supreme Court justice in 1967, and who is really like a towering figure in the civil rights movement as a legal thinker, providing intellectual heft behind civil rights. And he becomes a real titan of the court all the way through until 1993. And then against that background of Brown v. Board, and it's important to note with Brown v. Board that the decision really has symbolic importance. That 1954 decision does not actually change the conditions of Black folks in schools in the South. Those schools are really not integrated, and it actually takes a second Brown versus Board decision to get the courts to force and to demand that schools begin integrating, because they don't do that in the wake of the first decision. But the decision is important because it suggests that judicial deference to the South is not inevitable, that there is a legal rationale for integration located in the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, and it provides a symbolic victory for the NAACP and the Black community and the Black civil rights movement that's really profoundly important. It suggests that they can win. In 1955, one of the turning points building on Brown v. Board is the lynching of Emmett Till, whose mother, people are aware of it. I don't want to, kind of reintroduce all of the scenes and get too deep into the situation of violence. It was an awful lynching. It's horrible and very disturbing. And his mother decides to have an open casket funeral so that people can see what's been done to her son. It creates an enormous outcry of anger at the ongoing repression of Black folks in the US. And on the backs of Brown versus Board plays a really important role in the ramping up of the civil rights movement, and Black folks deciding that the moment is right to refuse to cooperate with an ongoing regime of racial terrorism in the South and de facto segregation in the North. So there's a number of different elements of the civil rights movement. Paradoxically, I don't want to go too deep into the civil rights movement, in part because this is history that many of you are already familiar with and that gets discussed a lot, and in part because part of the story of mass incarceration is not about the victories of the civil rights movement. It's in part about the enormous backlash to that movement. But I do want to talk about it and at least give you some of the outlines. The movement emerges in the 1950s, urged on by Brown v. Board, as well as Emmett Till's lynching and these various and sundry other political movements occurring at the time. Activists use a combination of boycotts, marches, and sit-ins to affect civil disobedience with institutions that are segregated. There are, at the peak of the movement in 1963, there are 1,000 protests in 100 cities occurring. The protests have a complex relationship with national politics. There are times when they benefit from Northern Democrats and when Northern Democrats are supportive of the civil rights movement. There are also key moments when Northern Democrats betray the movement or do not give their full support. And Southern Democrats, at sort of every step along the way, are attempting to break or hinder the progress of the movement. And Northern Democrats often cut deals with some Southern Democrats in order to advance other programs or to get other political priorities through. So several major legislative victories come out of the civil rights movement, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which really cements the gains won in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and ensures that ongoing attempts to use poll taxes and literacy tests in the South are simply no longer viable. And it's really with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that Black political enfranchisement and Black personhood are really first recognized again in the US for the first time since radical Reconstruction. At the same time that this is occurring, there's, from 1956 especially onward, there's a Southern Manifesto that's released in the South vowing to maintain Jim Crow. There's the formation of white citizens councils, new segregation laws are passed, and the KKK reasserts itself, attempting to really ensure that the civil rights movement cannot go too far, using a combination of the Southern Democrats' political power and the political monopoly, the sort of one-state regime of racial terrorism exercised by Southern Democrats in state legislatures and municipal offices, and also a campaign of paramilitary violence carried out by the KKK and other white terrorists. So there's really a coordinated attempt between the police and the KKK to ensure that segregation remains. And one of the important things that comes out of that is that, first of all, the KKK is frequently committing acts that are criminal and illegal, murdering people, killing them, intimidating them at the voting booth, causing physical harm to people, sending death threats, committing property damage, doing all sorts of awful and horribly violent things. And they're, in many, many, many cases, and really the vast majority of cases, they're not being charged with any crimes. So there is wanton violence being committed by the KKK and other white paramilitary terrorist organizations in the South that's not being tried and it's not being taken seriously by the elected governments. At the same time, civil rights leaders are being arrested, beaten by police, and there is a consistent rhetoric, and Michelle Alexander talks about this in the new Jim Crow, among Southern segregationist Democrats to call out the civil rights movement for violating laws. There's this whole complaint raised that if civil rights leaders engage in civil disobedience, it means that people are simply selecting which laws they choose to obey and which they choose to circumvent. And Alexander says there's a number of academic studies that support the idea that crime bills introduced in the 50s and 60s are supported by Southern segregationists. And there's a direct correlation between their opposition to voting rights and civil rights bills and their support for crime bills. So there's some real statistical and qualitative evidence to suggest that Southern segregationists are using crime during this time period as a coded language. And oftentimes they use explicitly racist language as well, but as a coded language and as a coded political strategy to repress civil disobedience and to repress civil rights movements in the US. So already we can start to see in the 1950s and 1960s that crime and policing are being used as tools for maintaining white supremacy and segregation. However, those tools are not effective. There's significant mobilizations that occur. Hundreds of thousands, and in some cases, millions of people are mobilized by the civil rights movement in the marches that take place during the movement. And it successfully manages to, using a combination of civil disobedience tactics, protest tactics, and legislative coalition building to build support for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, importantly, as I mentioned before, the civil rights movement was re-envisioned by Martin Luther King as a poor people's movement in the mid to late 1960s, and had become and started to morph into a multiracial populist alliance against economic inequality that sought to overthrow the prevailing racial caste system. And that movement was aided, and this is especially where the AFL-CIO labor union became a real ally of the civil rights movement. So whereas in previous eras, the labor union had many times been racist, or had been at best a sort of self-interested, lukewarm ally of civil rights movements. By the 1960s, labor unions had become an integral part of the civil rights movement and the aims it was seeking to uphold. And Black worker mobilizations played a tremendous role in the civil rights movement. The sanitation workers strike in Memphis is an example, but there are tons of other examples. The Detroit Auto Workers Union was a union that had primarily Black membership that played a really important role in lending political, social, and economic support to the civil rights movement. And it's at that time that support for the civil rights movement starts to turn, and a real backlash starts to happen against that multiracial populist alliance. So in 1964, Barry Goldwater runs for the Republican nomination and successfully wins the Republican nomination as an extreme conservative, both a racial conservative and a extreme libertarian, very aggressively opposed to government regulation of the economy, to the role of labor unions, to discourses about economic inequality. So it runs an extreme conservative platform. And his campaign in 1964 primes the GOP for a shift to tough on crime rhetoric. He uses that language and that rhetoric, and that plays an important part in the eventual Southern strategy that emerges from the right, that attempts to backlash against the civil rights movement. So in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, and as it's going on, Goldwater, by the way, I should finish that part of the narrative. Goldwater, by the way, runs for the presidency in 1964 and is crushed by Johnson in one of the worst electoral defeats in modern American political history. It's a total crush for Johnson. But into 1968, the Johnson becomes increasingly unpopular as a result of the Vietnam War, and as a result of the backlash against the Vietnam War, both because people no longer support the Vietnam War and are angry about it, and because there's a massive amount of social unrest that's being created by movements against the Vietnam War, by the civil rights movement, by student activists, by the formation of the New Left, which opposes the Vietnam War, racial discrimination, and calls for a new sort of era of labor rights and labor protections. So that for right-wing voters, Johnson is no longer appealing for more conservative Democrats because there's, in their view, too much social unrest that he's not effectively controlling, while for more left-wing Democrats, Johnson becomes unpalatable because he's supporting a war that they think is unjust and no longer acceptable. And as a result, he chooses rather late in the race not to seek the nomination in 1968 for the Democratic ticket. There's a whole bunch of back and forth about who could have won the 1968 election and blah, blah, blah. It's very complicated. There's a lot of different thoughts about it. There's a number of different candidates running in 1968 that are challenging Johnson when Johnson drops out. There's some thought that Robert Kennedy would have won the election had he not been assassinated after the California primary. There's some thought that that's bunk and that he would have lost the election anyway. So there's a lot of counterfactuals there, but suffice to say that Richard Nixon wins the 1968 election. And in that 1968 election, Nixon pursues something called the Southern Strategy that seeks to peel away the South from Democratic control and appeal to blue-collar Catholic, Italian, and Irish voters in urban areas like Chicago, like Milwaukee, Kansas City, St. Louis, Akron, Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio. So there's a number of different, New York as well. So there's a number of different major northern industrial cities that that Richard Nixon is looking to peel away these blue-collar Catholic voters who have traditionally been voters in what's called the Democratic political machine, who have been partially as a result of churches and partially as a result of their labor unions, steady Democratic voters who have supported the party and have been turned out to the polls by labor unions and by religious entities. So Nixon seeks to peel away the racist Democratic South, as well as these blue-collar Catholic voters who he believes are also sort of susceptible to the idea that social order is decaying, that cities have been overrun by student hippie activists and by Black militants. And so he attempts to capitalize on that theory, that the idea that there is this bubbling racial sentiment of anti-Black backlash waiting to be exploited by a conservative political candidate. So he uses the rhetoric of law and order, calling himself the law and order president. He, like I said before, this is presaged by the link between crime bills and anti-civil rights legislation. And it's carried out through these anti-Black, tough on crime dog whistles that use crime to mean cracking down on civil rights movements, on labor mobilizations, on student protests, on Vietnam War protests. And unfortunately, at the same time that this is occurring, there are a number of different major sources of urban unrest and rioting that occur. There are riots in Harlem and Watts in Los Angeles, in part as a result of police brutality, and in part as a result of enormous economic inequality and discrimination against Black folks in those areas that occur. And those are the images are presented throughout the media and circulated very heavily in the white mainstream media to present the idea that there's substance for fears, for white fears about Black riots, Black unrest, that all of these concessions made to Black voters and to Black folks in the South have given in and enabled exactly the kind of unrest that, going all the way back to the conservative Southern philosophy of the redemption, to Birth of a Nation, to the images presented in Jim Crow, there's for some reason that these images of urban riot substantiate the idea that Black folks aren't ready to participate in civil society and are dangerous. So there's really a lot of white fears being primed when, again, to go back to Murdahl and Bunch's report in American Dilemma, in reality, what's happening is police brutality and an ongoing system of economic and social repression in those neighborhoods that is continued despite the civil rights movement and despite protests and labor mobilization and anger about the Vietnam War. That despite all that social mobilization, people in these areas in Harlem and Watts are still being treated terribly, are still suffering from the same kind of violence and brutality they've been suffering from for decades. So in reality, those riots and unrest are, as Martin Luther King would say, the voice of the unheard, the language of the unheard, people who have not been listened to. And they are blamed for speaking out against white oppression in those areas. So on the one hand, there's these images that Nixon feels like he can play upon that are in the popular consciousness and the imaginary. And there's in particular, there's, in 1968, there are a variety of protests and unrest in Detroit that Nixon uses as sort of evidence that a crackdown and a tough on crime candidate is necessary. In addition, Michelle Alexander talks about the fact that there was and they talk about this in 13th, the documentary as well, there's a 10-year increase in crime rates in the 1960s. Now, Nixon and conservatives, racial conservatives and racists of various stripes pointed to these increase in crime rates as evidence that the civil rights movement had created this culture of, and the Vietnam War protests and student activism created this culture of lawlessness and civil disobedience in which people, like I said before, felt like they could disobey whatever laws they wanted to, that obedience to the law was obligatory. And really the reason sociologists and historians argue that these crime rates increased was because of demographic shifts that occurred in the US population, in which an extremely large percentage of the US population was between 15 and 24 years old. And there's a really robust body of literature suggesting that those between 15 and 24 tends to be really across American history the group of people that test boundaries, that test authority, that are in the process of forming their own sense of identity. Now, neuroscientists would say that these are the moments when people's prefrontal cortex is the most flexible, so it's possible for those people to learn and have more fluid intelligence than older people do. Their views are less set, so they're more prone to test boundaries and to engage in an experimental process of identity formation that doesn't occur for older people whose prefrontal cortex is relatively fixed, whose brain is somewhat less plastic and less capable of fluid intelligence, and has somewhat less habituated patterns. So folks in the age group of 15 to 24, when there's large populations of 15 to 24-year-olds, sociologists and historians argue, crime rates go up. And it's really true. It's not always culturally invariant, but that's a general trend globally. There tends to be more social unrest when the population in a country that's between 15 and 24 is a larger percentage of the total population. So Alexander and the documentary 13th say that really these crime rates are attributable to these demographic shifts, not to there's not really reason to believe that Nixon's claims about lawlessness and cultural breakdown have merit. And at the same time, it's also the case that people are being sent to Vietnam to die in a draft that is viewed by many Americans to be profoundly unjust, fighting in a war that's needless and excessive and really overly aggressive and violent in Vietnam. So there's a sense that average Americans are being sent off to commit genocide in Vietnam for no real gain. And that anger at that fact does in some ways provoke really radical social mobilization, to the extent that there is an increase in crime rates in some small part at least. It's probably also attributable to meaningful social unrest created by a national draft that sent hundreds of thousands of people to die in Vietnam, huge numbers. Nixon wins the 1968 election, running on this tough on crime narrative. And while Nixon pursues to some extent a tough on crime agenda, his agenda is more about crackdown than it is about he doesn't feed mass incarceration in the same way that Reagan and some of the later political figures do. However, what he does do, like I said before, is rhetorically prime the voting public for some of the arguments that will come later. And he creates that anti-Black dog whistle of crime as a coded discourse for thinking about white supremacy. So at this time period, there are Alexander argues, there's kind of two competing social imaginaries emerging as a result of the party realignment. And Nixon and Lyndon Johnson's actions to support the civil rights movement kind of facilitated this party realignment. So there's two social imaginaries on display in the late 1960s and early 1970s. One social imaginary says that poverty is caused by quote unquote Black pathology. And that's epitomized by and circulated through the Moynihan Report, which I described earlier, which argues that there's a poor Black subculture of delinquency, street crime, and illegal drug use caused by an overly generous welfare system and an overly permissive set of social codes about protest and social unrest. So tough on crime and welfare reform policies are framed as shifts necessary to bring about changes in Black culture. In essence, poverty is viewed as the byproduct of Black cultural pathology. So that's one social imaginary on display. The other social imaginary on display is the view that poverty is caused by cycles of deprivation. And this harkens all the way back to An American Dilemma and Myrdal and Bunch's report. And importantly, as I mentioned before, Gunnar Myrdal and many of those people who held the view that poverty was caused by cycles of deprivation were heavily involved in labor mobilization and in social democratic or democratic socialist politics. So those people were involved in the types of labor mobilizations that the civil rights movement had begun to transform into. This social imaginary said that the war on poverty initiated by the Johnson administration and various kinds of integrated education programs were effectively anti-crime legislation because they addressed the root cause of poverty, which was social deprivation, a lack of resources, opportunity, and social infrastructure, and a lack of respect for the personhood of Black folks as fully enfranchised human beings with full protection of law. And they argued that federal action was necessary to correct the excesses of the economic system. And this is really at the peak of, I keep coming back to this, but this is so important for understanding the civil rights movement. And in part, it helps to explain why conservative politicians, especially, and some neoliberal democratic politicians, appropriating the legacy of Martin Luther King to support market-oriented, free market-oriented democracy is so perverse, because this theory of poverty being caused by cycles of deprivation, which are themselves the root cause of crime, that theory is coming to fruition at a point in 1963, and 1965, 1968, when labor organizations in the US represent roughly 1/3 of American workers. This is both the peak of the civil rights movement and the peak of the labor mobilization. And those two things go hand in hand, which was always at the sort of front of the rhetoric that Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement pushed. Again, the movement was being reconceived as a poor people's movement when Martin Luther King was assassinated. So in the 1968 election, Nixon uses this rhetoric of deserving and undeserving poor. And Nixon and George Wallace both use law and order rhetoric as an aggressive dog whistle. During the same time, after Nixon's election, there's a real process of white flight, in part due to media images of urban unrest and riot, in part due to racist dog whistles, the rise of white supremacy, the sort of Nixon era tough on crime backlash. White people flee cities for suburbs, abandoning public schools and public transportation, and turning their back on welfare systems in order to adapt this political mindset of law and order. They increasingly working class and lower middle class white folks come to see welfare systems as bad, in part because they start to buy the social imaginary that Black pathology is being enabled by an overly generous welfare system. So there's this movement of white flight to leave cities that had started earlier in the 1960s, but it really picks up in the late 1960s. In the 1970s, Weequaquot argues that increasingly there's a collapse of Black employment wrought by globalization and wrought by deindustrialization in the United States, creating a politics of resentment. So it's the same time that white people are fleeing cities for suburbs, employment in those cities is starting to dry up. The sort of golden age of American labor and American advanced industrial manufacturing is starting to come to an end. And a lot of the high-paying jobs that required only a high school education, or sometimes not even a high school education, are no longer there. Life becomes a lot more labor and affording day-to-day life become a lot more of a struggle, a complex problem. So what happens is that there's a real loss of opportunity for Black folks in cities at the same time as those very same Black folks are being stigmatized and pathologized for having this subculture of delinquency, as the Moynihan report calls it. And what happens is that there are really increasingly fewer manufacturing jobs for those without college degrees. There's massive unemployment for Black men in particular. Black women fare somewhat better in employment rates because traditionally feminized service sector jobs start to increase. But even then, the jobs that Black women are able to get, come with enormous strings attached. They're much more poorly paid. There's very little opportunity for advancement, and they're frequently subject to sexual violence in the workplace, often by white male coworkers. So there's some level of economic opportunity for Black women in service sector jobs, but those jobs come with major strings attached. And for Black men in traditionally masculine gendered industries, those jobs in manufacturing start to dry up. In part, during this time period, there are major, and I'll talk about this a little bit in the other lecture, but I do want to mention it here. There are major political economic changes occurring. Barriers to trade are beginning to be reduced as a result of a sort of growing international trading system. And as a result, there's increasing competition between the labor sectors of different economies. Backlash on the part of the Nixon administration and subsequent Republican and even Democratic administrations towards labor unions starts to dry up some of the labor protections that those unions relied on. The composition of the Supreme Court starts to change. It becomes much less sympathetic to the claims brought by labor unions and labor organizations. And as well, the US leaves the gold standard, which there's good reasons for the US to have officially leaves the gold standard. There's good reasons for the US to have done that, but that creates turmoil in the global political economy. And there's also two successive oil crises that occur in the 1970s. And in general, the 1970s is a moment when there is just general massive unrest globally. 1968 is a real turning point year, but in the 1970s as well, there's massive labor unrest. And a lot of countries are really dealing with how to solidify and move from an industrializing low income or middle income economy into a higher income economy in which the gains of production are shared equally among workers. And many of them are struggling to deal with that because capitalists are moving their money out of the country and seeking to divide labor against itself using globalization and the rollback of barriers to trade. The story is much more complicated than that. I don't want to present that, free trade is entirely the enemy. There are plenty of good things that come out of the free trading system, and there are plenty of problems with global international protectionism. But in many ways, there's massive disruption caused for U.S. manufacturing, and the gains of trade tend to be spread among people throughout the U.S., while the losses are very concentrated, particularly for Black workers in urban core areas. And those losses are experienced very acutely in massive Black unemployment and underemployment and the real drying up of Black wage growth starting in the 1970s. So there's this tremendous period of real economic and social rollback for Black folks living in urban areas, even as white folks are moving out of those areas to suburbs. And that's been happening, like I said before, from the 1950s through the 1960s. But that white flight really accelerates in the 1960s. And white people are able to get access to home loans and to capital that many Black folks are simply not able to get access to. And they move to suburbs and neighborhoods that have housing covenants that prevent or prohibit Black folks from moving to those neighborhoods. So there's a tremendous amount of segregation in housing that occurs during this time period as well. So what ends up happening is that the places where jobs, the TLDR is that the places where jobs start to dry up are the areas where Black folks are located, and the places where job growth and opportunity and access to housing and capital start to emerge are areas where that really only white folks can take advantage of. So there's this kind of increasing divide in the political economy. Part of that's deindustrialization and globalization, and part of that is racist housing policy, housing covenants, and white flight out of cities. So one of the points that LeQuant makes is that we're about to talk about the emergence of mass incarceration and the mass incarceration system. One of the points that LeQuant makes is that the carceral system in this period, in the late 1970s, of deindustrialization, of tremendously high Black unemployment, of racist images of urban unrest and violence in cities, the carceral system starts to play a similar transitional function in the US political economy as Jim Crow played, as convict leasing played in the South's shift from slavery to Jim Crow. So the carceral system plays a function of managing unrest, economic instability, and Black anger at a lack of opportunity, political recognition, social equality, et cetera. The difference between the carceral system that we're about to talk about in just a second, and the emergence of that system, and convict leasing, is that where convict leasing, the primary motivation of convict leasing was to functionally re-enslave Black people, to exploit their labor and to use it to accumulate wealth on the part of the white plantation elite in the South. The carceral system does not primarily have as its goal the exploitation of labor. We'll talk in a minute about, and we'll talk in the other lecture as well, about private prisons and the exploitation of labor in prisons. Those things certainly do happen, but I think LeQuant, Alexander, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and many others convincingly argue that the primary motivation of the prison system is not exploitation of the labor of prisoners. Instead, the primary motivation of the carceral system is to maintain and to enact a new racial caste system, a new white over Black social hierarchy, in which the prison houses surplus labor populations. So rather than exploiting those labor populations in an era of deindustrialization, when many of those jobs are starting to dry up, when the political economic situation of high unemployment starts to emerge, the solution to that problem is to throw Black people in jail to prevent their outrage at unemployment, at a lack of social and political recognition, from turning into effective labor mobilization or political movements for equality that can exercise real power at the voting booth. So just to the point when Black people are starting to gain enfranchisement, to become a real force in political economy, both at the voting booth and in labor unions, deindustrialization begins to occur, labor unions start to lose their power and their legal protections, and Black people are forced in prison through the development of a carceral system that, as we'll see in just a minute, robs them of the franchise. So the carceral system, like I said, plays a similar function in the South as to convict leasing, in the shift from an industrial manufacturing economy to our contemporary service-oriented economy in an era of globalization. So again, I want to reiterate that the story of racial caste in the United States is sort of two parallel tracks. There's the racism of white folks who don't want to live next door to Black people, who flee for the suburbs because they buy into these images of urban unrest, who think that that the civil rights movement is simply an invitation for crime, for looting, for violence. There's that social racism, a desire to hang on to the psychological wage that comes from having advantages that Black people don't have, and comes from repressing Black folks from having institutions that they can't gain access to. There's that motivation for the racial caste system. And then there's also the political economic, or the labor-based, capital-based explanation for the racial caste system, in which the changing nature of the US political economy and the production process of where the gains are going and how gains are being generated creates an economic motivation to subjugate Black folks and to ensure they are permanently kept in an undercast position in society. So both of those motivations in Alexander and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, LeQuant, many of the theorists in the 13th documentary as well, emphasize that both of these motivations are going on at the same time. And there an explicit strategy being used by business organizations and conservatives in the Republican Party, using pathologization of Black people to roll up support for welfare programs, to delegitimize those programs, and to delegitimize labor protections, and to delegitimize major social mobilizations like the civil rights movement, Vietnam War protest movements, the New Left, etc. All of this really begins to take off. So this is all background, late 1970s, during the 1980 election, in which Reagan, who is explicitly intellectually influenced by Goldwater, takes on the language of Nixon, deploys the Southern strategy, seeking to use dog whistles to pull racist white Southerners to the Republican Party and away from their traditional position in the Democratic Party as Democratic Party voters, and seeks to divide ethnic white urban Catholic voters, blue-collar voters, against the Democratic Party, to peel away more of those voters. So he uses the language of welfare queens, suggesting that there are Black women who are getting rich off of welfare fraud. He uses the language of states' rights, saying that many of the labor protections and regulations instituted in the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which require and impose some really strict regulations on Southern states and their voting procedures, that those are a massive overreach of federal control. He uses the language of criminal predators to argue that there are people who are looting and exploiting the rhetoric of civil rights and the sort of generosity of unevenly enforced laws. So his campaign presents programs like food stamps as vehicles for Black welfare recipients to buy steaks. This is almost explicitly an ad that, paraphrased version of an ad that Reagan used, while working class white people bought cheap food like hamburger. In the process, however, that rhetoric, that anti-Black rhetoric, is always sublimated. This is a key element of the Southern strategy. It's always abstracted to a higher level as being about criminality and welfare fraud and exploitation of the system and states' rights. It's never said quite explicitly. And what that does is it means that those who try to point out that the system is anti-Black and racist are constantly gaslit. It introduces a level of plausible deniability. I mean, it's not really plausible, but at least a level of political deniability to the rhetoric to make it appear to be colorblind. And Alexander notes that in part that's a byproduct of an actual shift in American public polling, where Americans want to think of themselves as not being racist. That shift occurs as a result of the tremendous success of the civil rights movement and its mobilization. That the average American person does not want to think of themselves as a racist, and they don't want to support legislation that's explicitly racist. So this colorblind rhetoric gives them the ability to say that they are not racist, that they don't, quote unquote, they don't see race, while at the same time supporting policies and candidates that are explicitly producing anti-Black political outcomes. In particular, one of the major elements of Reagan's presidency is Reagan's decision in 1982 to declare a war on drugs. At the time, this is really not a concern. I want to give a little bit more brief background. There's very little concern in polls about drugs. They're not a major policy issue. And in general, Michelle Alexander emphasizes that in the 1970s, the size of the US prison population is really quite small by comparison with today. And in the 13th, they make the point, the various commentators in 13th make the point that the prison population in the US relative to the size of the US population had remained mostly flat throughout the 20th century. It has periods of ups and downs and shifts, but it's relatively a similar percentage of the total US population. There were many sociologists and social psychologists in the late 1960s and 1970s who believed legitimately that the prison as an institution, based upon the scientific evidence that had built up over time, was about to be abolished as an institution. There was very little gain that it served any rehabilitative function. There was very little evidence to suggest that it served a deterrent function. There was significant evidence to suggest that it promoted a really violent and aggressive culture that was dangerous for inmates, in which they were subjugated and beaten really aggressively, that the position of prison guards was like what really functionally was an authoritarian position that allowed them to carry out brutal violence that had some really dangerous social consequences. So all these experiments are being done in the 1970s, and many people believe, according to Alexander, that the prison system may really be abolished. So that's where the evidence is starting to head, and that's where it seems like society is pushing. And while there has been some increase in the prison population from 1972 to the Reagan presidency, that it hasn't really exploded at that point. But in 1982, Reagan declares the war on drugs, and the DOJ shifts focus from white collar to street crime. As we're going to talk about in the Political Economy of Prisons and Policing lecture, it's not as simple as just the war on drugs. Alexander's book has been criticized a little bit, and she has admitted to some of these criticisms, that it emphasizes the role of the federal war on drugs a bit too much. And there are other political economic forces at work there. The role of police unions, the role of neoliberal ideology in rolling back certain forms of state funding and then apportioning other forms of state funding for prisons and policing and punitive action. So there are a number of different factors at work here apart from just the war on drugs. But I think everybody agrees that the Reagan administration's war on drugs did play a really important role in the explosion, and that drug crimes played a pretty important role in the explosion of policing and mass incarceration. So they do play an important role. So 1982, Reagan declared the war on drugs, and the DOJ shifted focus from white-collar crime to street crime. The FBI, the Department of Defense, and the DEA budgets for anti-drug activity massively increased. The National Institute on Drug Abuse and the Department of Education budgets for drug rehab and treatment are massively reduced. And Reagan leads a media offensive to justify the war on drugs to the public, circulating crack cocaine and urban decay narratives. To some extent, Reagan is unique in circulating this crack cocaine narrative, where, as I said before, the urban decay narrative is an important part of political rhetoric going back to the Goldwater administration and even further back to Southern Democrats in the 1950s. So there's a whole discourse about the rise of a crack epidemic. Now, while it's true, and Alexander points this out, it is true that there are some really negative repercussions of crack on Black communities in the mid-1980s. That epidemic, and to the extent that it's an epidemic, drug abuse of crack does not really start until 1985, 3 years after Reagan had begun publicizing a crack epidemic and had made a bunch of choices about how to publicize that agenda. As Alexander points out, the fact that drug abuse increased in white and Black communities, by the way, during the middle of the 1980s did not mandate the policing agenda that Reagan pushed. Portugal, for example, starting in this time period up through now, dealt with severe drug abuse issues, but chose rehabilitation, drug liberalization, and treatment, producing much more successful policy outcomes than policing did. So even to the extent that there was eventually an issue with crack and cocaine abuse throughout the country in the mid-1980s, that issue did not mandate the policing-related policy strategies that Reagan chose. But nevertheless, even to the extent that crack abuse did eventually become an issue in the mid-1980s, that was years after Reagan had already primed the public for the belief that the crack epidemic had taken hold. And there was significant evidence to suggest that there are many ways in which that crack epidemic there's a lot of debate about this, but that some of the issues with crack in Black neighborhoods were facilitated by, or at least not helped by, the national governments. That there may have been some really pernicious roles that major urban police departments in the national government played in the eventual issues with crack in Black neighborhoods. And as I pointed out before, there were also major issues with drug abuse in white neighborhoods as well during the same time period. They just weren't messaged and understood in the same way that issues with drug abuse in Black neighborhoods were. So conservatives were primed by and really white voting publics in general were primed to support policing by the rhetoric of civil rights backlash and by DEA and FBI agents that capitalized using a sustained campaign to nationalize crack and busts and drug busts, producing a feeding frenzy in the national media. So there's a whole bunch of national media attention devoted to drug crime, even though prior to Reagan declaring the war on drugs, this was not considered a major national issue, was not considered a problem. There's a flurry of legislative activity that happens as a result. There's a mandatory minimum bill that passed in 1986, punishing crack differently from cocaine, despite the fact that, as I noted before, cocaine abuse in white communities was a significant problem, along with increases in budgets for anti-drug policing. There's relatively little opposition in Congress to that bill. And in 1988, there's another bill passed authorizing new penalties, including public housing eviction, loss of student loans, et cetera, for those convicted of drug crimes, accompanied by an expansion in the use of the death penalty and mandatory minimums. So during this time period, there's already this just like massive sort of feedback cycle. Electoral rhetoric is used about getting tough on crime that attempts to capitalize on anti-Black attitudes in the white and non-Black voting public. In turn, that tough on crime rhetoric leads to a whole series of media publicity and funding priority shifts that make drug crime in Black neighborhoods a specific policy priority, despite the fact there's little evidence that they needed to be treated as a specific public policy priority, despite the fact there's little evidence that it's an effective policy solution to the issue to the extent that it exists. And then in the process, those policing activities, as they're carried out in Black neighborhoods, as the FBI and the DEA are given tons of money and tools and a series of very favorable Supreme Court decisions allowing those policing activities to take place, they uncover, occasionally in the course of a massive set of crackdowns and drug sweeps, evidence of drug abuse. They publicize it nationally in a media environment that's already favorable to that coverage. And that proves that the problem exists, and then the cycle starts all over again. There's a reinforcing of the political salience and the political effectiveness of this rhetoric. There's more money appropriated and more Supreme Court deference given to policing of drug crimes. Additional legislation gives additional tools for stricter crackdowns and fewer protections of the people who are being policed. And that leads to, again, more drugs being found and more evidence being produced of the problem in the first place. And again, to go back to an American dilemma, this is a case of the culmination, the principle of culmination, in which the oppression undertaken in sort of anti-Black, tough on crime environment subsequently becomes evidence confirming discourses of Black pathology. It produces that evidence. As Michelle Alexander says, Black folks are made criminals as a result of the war on drugs. They're not previously criminal, but an entire social, political, and cultural apparatus is deployed to them to produce them as such, to make them appear as criminals. And in the process, there's a real association developed between Blackness and criminality, that a whole series of discourses emerge in which Black folks are presented on news media in a dramatically overrepresented way. Shows like Cops become popular, in which Black street crime is dramatically overrepresented on the shows versus its actual statistical prevalence. There's a whole series of Nightline News and various other news programs presenting specials about Black crime and inner city dysfunction. And attitudes towards crime very quickly become correlated with racial attitudes rather than crime rates or the likelihood of victimization. So white folks tend to support backlash to or crackdowns on crime because they are already racially conservative, or as a proxy for their racial attitudes, rather than because they are particularly likely to be victims of crime based on where they live, or because crime rates are going up in the country as a whole. So increasingly, the Southern strategy, which set out to create a link between crime as an abstract term sublimating anti-Black racism, effectively does change voters' attitudes, creating a link between the idea of criminality and crime and Black folks, so that crackdowns on crime mean crackdowns on Black people. And the punitiveness of punishment becomes increasingly decoupled from the threat of crime to the individual. People who are really punitive about drug crime are no longer necessarily people who are likely to be subject to crime. In general, Black folks who live in the areas where they're the most likely to be victimized as a result of some of the political economic factors like globalization that we talked about earlier, and by extreme deprivation and over-policing, while they are the most likely to be victimized by crime, they do not support punitive sentencing and are not interested in punitive sentencing. Conversely, there's heavy support among rural white folks who, by virtue of living in very low population density areas, are unlikely to be victimized by crimes. There's very high support for punitiveness among them for crime. So increasingly, like I said, the war on drugs and racial attitudes become linked together. And Alexander points out again that the fact that this is a system that's formally, that's at an explicit level colorblind, means that there's a lot of plausible deniability, and that attacks that the system is racist are then read or gaslit as political correctness, as an attempt to turn everything into an issue of race. So while there is really quite striking statistical and sociological evidence that race and tough on crime rhetoric are linked, the fact that the system and that the language is formally colorblind creates license to make those who call out the racist effects of the system for being overly politically correct, for quote unquote playing the race card, a discourse that becomes really prominent in the 1980s and 1990s conservative political culture. So in the 1988 election, Dukakis is leading George H.W. Bush, and then Bush, and this is, again, according to the documentary 13th, Bush runs this really incredibly racist Willie Horton ad, which presents these images, these really menacingly produced images of this man, Willie Horton, a convict who was on a work release program in Massachusetts, Dukakis' home state, and who raped and murdered a family, uses these images of Willie Horton combined with tough on crime appeals. And it's very obvious that the purpose of this advertisement and its appeal is to create fear of Black folks among white folks. And that anti-Black appeal works. It symbolizes Bush's embrace of the drug war and opposition to affirmative action and legal enforcement of civil rights. And by 1989, partly as a result of this campaign, the media attitudes at the time, the various social and cultural media presentations happening, polling showed 64% of voters thought drugs were the greatest threat facing the nation, despite the really weak correlation between drug use and abuse and crime statistics, and despite a lack of evidence, frankly, showing that war on drugs policies were at all effective in reducing the prevalence of drug use. By the late 1980s, Democrats have also begun to embrace a tough on crime rhetoric and mentality. And the social imaginary that I described before as being prominent in the late 1960s and early 1970s, which showed that poverty is caused by cycles of deprivation and that the best anti-crime policy was poverty reduction policy, that social imaginary, even amongst Democrats and liberals, has largely begun to erode. And instead, they have also begun to embrace a tough on crime rhetoric mentality, repeating this old pattern of focusing on attracting poor and working class white swing voters by being willing to re-entrench a new racial caste system. So by the late 1980s, Democrats increasingly are swept up in the need to offer racial bribes to poor and white working class voters and to engage in anti-Black tough on crime rhetoric in order to win elections. The 1992 election, Bill Clinton co-opts conservative tough on crime rhetoric during the election and travels back to Arkansas to oversee the execution of a severely mentally ill convict during the election. In 94, Clinton signs the crime bill creating 3 strikes policy. It produces dozens of new capital crimes, and it massively expands the budget for prisons and policing. In 96, Clinton signed the Welfare Reform Act, shifting to TANF block grants to states, and imposing a 5-year lifetime limitation on welfare utilization, while permanently banning those convicted of felony drug crimes from accessing welfare benefits. He also passed additional legislation the same year barring those convicted of crimes from receiving federal assistance. Additionally, despite claims of fiscal discipline, Clinton only reallocated existing funding for managing the urban poor to policing and away from housing assistance, drug rehabilitation, et cetera. So despite all this rhetoric about managing the deficit and concern about spending on entitlement programs, in reality, Clinton ends up, through all the support for policing and prisons and the war on drugs, ends up spending more money than is saved by welfare reform and cutting back on welfare spending. As we'll talk about in the political economy of policing and prisons lecture, there's a whole series of complex economic ideologies and that are linked to anti-Blackness that are that undergird that set of policy decisions and that rhetoric. So tough on crime rhetoric by the 1990s and in 2000 had become virtually hegemonic in American political discourse and the American political economy. More than 2 million people were behind bars and banished to a social caste in which access to federal resources was denied. And it's really important to sit for a minute and think about the consequences of the system. The US, by I think roughly 2000, had 25% of the incarcerated people in the world, despite having roughly 5% of the world's population, had more incarcerated people than any other country in the world by far. The size of the prison system had exploded from, I believe, roughly 300,000 imprisoned people in 1972. And I may be misremembering these numbers from 13th, but it's roughly 300,000 people in 1972 to about 2 million people. So a massive explosion in the number of incarcerated people. A remarkably disproportionate percentage of those people are Black folks, and there's very relative to their proportionality in the U.S. population, there's a disproportionately small number of white folks that are incarcerated, and this feeds what Loic Wacquant says are the role of prisons. So Black mass incarceration and this whole system of the war on drugs and policing operating in areas where Black unemployment is really high and where Black folks have functionally been rendered surplus populations, disposable within a service-oriented, globalized American political economy, that Black mass incarceration and anti-Black policing have led to Black imprisonments, the higher rates of imprisonment of Black people, serving as a warrant for treating race and crime as linked. And they have infected practices of policing and governance. So in this sense, prisons are engines of symbolic production, according to Wacquant, inducing the civic death of Black people by robbing them of cultural capital, social distribution of wealth, and political participation and recognition of their personhood. And major drivers there are the reform of the welfare system, which we'll talk about in just a second. So in effect, Wacquant argues, white people live in a society with prisons, in which prisons are one institution among many for disciplining labor and not central to social life, while by the period of 2000, Black people live in a genuine prison society in which prisons are a central axis of social life. And Wacquant says there's this sort of circuit that forms as a result of anti-Black policing and mass incarceration between the ghettos, which again function as an ethno-racial prison, according to Wacquant, and the prison itself, that these two areas function in a circuit so that Black folks are primed for imprisonment by a juvenile system and a school to prison pipeline that discipline them at every turn, that offer them very few resources for success and very little sense of care, compassion, love, empathy, and instead are constantly disciplining them according to these narratives of urban decay and a lack of personal responsibility. And what happens is then that the public at large, and Black folks in particular, are primed to go to prison by these narratives. They are then locked up as a result of being denied resources and being over-policed, being monitored at every turn, offered very few protections of privacy or very few protections from surveillance by policing. And then in the process, They're placed in prisons where they're stripped of voting rights. They're denied for life the ability to receive federal welfare and a series of other federal benefits. And they're placed into second-class citizen status. One of the points that Michelle Alexander makes is that really the important thing is not just sentencing, things like 3 strikes laws and mandatory minimums, which get a lot of play in sort of mainstream American political discourse these days. It's a bunch of other things as well. It's the inability for ex-convicts to vote. It's the near impossibility of ex-convicts finding employment and getting, being able to get a lease to live in an apartment. The social stigma that follows them around and that makes family and friends and non-governmental organizations not want to help them out, not want to give a lending hand to them for fear of seeming like they're soft on crime or for enabling failures of personal responsibility. There's a whole discourse of respectability politics that emerges, policing those individuals as failing to show a sense of personal responsibility and to show a sense of capacity. So at every level, the issue is that the convict or criminal becomes a stigma every bit as debilitating as the stigma of blackness was during Jim Crow in the South. Except that, as Alexander notes, it's even more stigmatizing in some ways and more dangerous because for 3 reasons. One is that formally, the system is colorblind, which makes it much more difficult to attack. And which means that in many ways, according to Alexander, while the Black community was united in opposing Jim Crow and in opposing previous systems of explicitly anti-Black segregation, there are divisions amongst the Black community. In many ways, those have dissolved as we've moved into the present day. But there are divisions, especially in the 90s and 2000s, among the Black community that stigmatized Black folks who were arrested and incarcerated. And that meant that the Black community in some ways was divided against itself by a whole series of racist media images, respectability politics, over policing by the principle of culmination and its use in various white paper reports about policing and reports about the quote unquote susceptibility of Black people to crime. So first, that the formally colorblind nature of the system makes it easier for white people to gaslight other white people and Black people who oppose the system. And secondly, that the colorblind nature of the system makes it easier to drive a wedge within the Black community using respectability politics discourse and the discourse of personal responsibility. The second reason that the prison system is so pernicious is that it makes the stigma of criminality, which denies someone access to economic, social, civic, political, etc. resources, that puts them in a position of civic death, as Raquant says. It's so pernicious because it makes it seem voluntary, that the choice to commit the crime is the reason that that person is in prison, not that laws, policy priorities, media images, economic resources and economic opportunity, social conditions, norms about space, housing policy have all changed. Not that in all those complex political economic factors have changed. Not that Supreme Court precedents and protections for labor and protections for ordinary people against policing, not that deference to police and funding for policing have all gone up, but instead it makes it seem like it's the choice of the individual criminal to participate. That is really the issue. So the system is so pernicious, the scarlet letter of ex-convict or ex-felon is so pernicious because it makes it seem like a voluntary choice on the part of the criminal to participate in the system, and it deflects attention from this massive change of structural conditions to that particular individual. And we're going to talk about that when we talk about neoliberal ideology and its role in prisons and punishment in the political economy of prisons and policing lecture as well. Thirdly, it's that prisons are located outside of the social gaze of white folks, particularly, and even in some ways of many Black folks that are not incarcerated, although that's less true in that case. And that's because, first, they are physically located in white rural areas, away from the sort of everyday public space and public infrastructure that people interact with, so that they're out of sight, out of mind, and not seen. They're both away from population centers, and even in the rural areas that they're in, they tend to be located away from the city center, away from its social and civic institutions. So they're located physically in places that make them hard to see. Secondly, people who are locked up are hard to get access to because they're locked up. It's quite frankly as simple as that. And that means that it's very difficult for them to tell their story. This pernicious discourse of respectability politics means they tend not to be sympathetic figures in media reports. It's very hard for them to get their story told. And they tend to be placed in a position where most people can't see them or interact with them. And so most people don't understand the tremendous amounts of violence that happen in prisons on the part of prison guards, the really extreme and unacceptable conditions that prisoners are placed in, the physically small areas they're located in, the bad food, the ridiculous fees they're charged to make phone calls to their loved ones, the sharecropping level exploitation of labor within prisons, in particular within private prisons. So a lot of those conditions are just never seen. And many people are not aware of the prevalence of the use of architectural forms like solitary confinement within prisons, simply because the prisons are not places that the public goes. There are spaces outside of public view. And then thirdly and finally, the last reason why prisons are not really visible in a public way goes to this sort of pervasive state of denial, what Michelle Alexander, quoting Stanley Cohen, calls sort of a knowing but not knowing on the part particularly of white folks, in which, because of their relatively smaller levels of interaction with police, with the Department of Justice, with prisons, because it's less likely that they know somebody who's gone to prison, in part because policing and the war on drugs are targeted specifically at Black communities, and police departments particularly do stop and frisk and narcotics sweeps in Black neighborhoods. They pull over Black motorists. That means that system of racial segregation has feedback effects in which white people are not aware of the pervasiveness of mass incarceration and racial violence. Many white people just simply, to Alexander's point, it is not hard to find evidence proving the extent of mass incarceration. It's not like the evidence is never there or never said or never spoken about, but it's very easy for them, if they don't go looking for it, not to encounter it in day-to-day conversations, in the everyday course of living their lives, in the media that they consume, in the sociality that they engage in the workplaces that they participate in, the religious institutions that they worship in. So it's very easy for that to be out of sight and out of mind. And that creates feedback effects where segregation begets more segregation. Again, that's an element of the principle of culmination, that it becomes very difficult to dispute the sort of pervasive discourse of Black criminal pathology, in part because white people simply refuse to go out and look for the evidence that they would need to educate themselves in the way they would need to be in order to dispute that fact. Now, obviously, like I've said, this narrative that I'm portraying only goes up to the year 2000. There are important changes that I'm not going to talk about here because this lecture has frankly already run extremely long. Changes in Supreme Court precedent. There are important changes in policing laws and regulations and policing practices that occur. Some of those we'll talk about in the Political Economy of Policing and Prisons lecture. But I'm not going to get to all of them. You will come across a lot of these things in your research. A lot of them will be fodder for affirmatives. There'll be some great evidence about the ways in which the rise of particular sets of legal decisions like McCleskey v. Kemp and legal judicially created doctrines like qualified immunity have given the police carte blanche to carry out some of the most dangerous elements of mass incarceration. You'll come across those things in the course of doing your research. So I want you to recognize that, obviously there's some pretty significant parts of my research I didn't get to talk about and of this story that's not presented here. And I also want you to recognize that, as many of you are aware, I'm only going up to the year 2000. So some of these things have changed. There's reason to be at least initially optimistic that Ferguson and Black Lives Matter, compounded by protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and movements for abolishing the police, have created some momentum, have created some social conditions, in part exacerbated by social media, in which it's really difficult to claim not to know about police violence, about mass incarceration, about the conditions of anti-Black immiseration that exist in the United States and that shape the U.S. Political economy and political institutions. So to a certain extent, that story that I'm telling, that prisons are out of sight and out of mind, is a story that was much more true of the political consensus up to really even going through the Obama administration. After Ferguson, after recent Black Lives Matter and abolish the police protests and defund the police protests have emerged, that pervasive narrative has become a little bit more clear, and it's a little bit harder for anybody, non-Black person of color, white or Black, to claim that they're not aware of the extent of police violence and the extent of police brutality and mass incarceration across the United States. So those conditions have changed to a certain extent. But as I talked about before, many of you are already aware of that. At least I really hope you're already aware of those movements and the ways that they have, at least initially, affected a really profound consciousness change. But I want you to be aware that is a really recent phenomenon, in that that there was an incredibly powerful hegemonic consensus in favor of tough on crime that existed even through much of the Obama administration. So hopefully this has given you a helpful overview, some helpful historical tools that you can use to bring context. I realize this lecture is very long. It's totally okay to break it up. I know many of you will. It's the end of the lecture, so if you're at this point, you've probably already done that. But it's totally okay to pick and choose the parts of this lecture to listen to it in pieces and bits. And the intention of it is really to serve as a resource, a touchstone for you to go back to and to use when you're doing research, when you're trying to remind yourself of some key historical events, and as a baseline that you can use for disagreement, for further historical research and consciousness raising of your own, to gain a better sense of how the historical political economy of the US and the US racial caste system has operated throughout time. Okay, awesome. Thank you.